this evening. And in many ways, they are going to be continuing with the previous opening session and give us some food for thought on the state of the world, the collaborations, the partnerships, the divisions, and sometimes even the apathy of various actors. But mostly, they will frame for us the context around which we will need to find solutions to climate change, to our SDG ambitions, to economic growth, to the globalization project itself. And unless we are honest and we discuss the differences and the potential possibilities, we will not be able to work together to solve some of the biggest challenges that confront us today as humanity. This also picks on from the agendas of India's G20 presidency, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We are one world, we have one future, we are a family, and I think it plays on that, how to rebuild that family, how to work together towards a common future. It also resonates with the South African presidency. In fact, they have a very similar term. I am because you are. I mean, there's a ethic that defines their presidency, and we are trying to bring that into this conversation as well. And then we also have two Europeans. And they are perhaps responding to the most intimate threat they have faced for a long time. Many of the conversations we are having in other parts of the world may seem less important at this particular point of time, but remember, Europe and certainly EU have been one of the largest contributors to development agendas, to climate action, to regulatory propositions on some of the most vital questions that confront us today. So EU as an actor is indispensable if we need to move to a future that is stable and prosperous. And we want to see the context, the viewpoints, perspectives from these two different parts of the world grappling with two different sets of priorities. Let me first start with Ambassador Chinoy. Since Ambassador Chinoy currently chairs the T20 process out of India and has been one of our most vocal and visible voices, articulating India's vision and India's ambitions around the presidency. Ambassador Chinoy, let me turn to you for the theme question itself. Polarized world, fragmented world order, how can we coalesce together at the G20? What are your ambitions to bring all of us together for a common future?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Saran. Firstly, it's a great privilege to be here in Kigali, which is one of the most dynamic parts of Africa. And it's entirely opposite that this topic is being discussed in a country that's dealt with fragmentation and polarized politics. And so there is a thing or two that we can learn from Rwanda as well, as we look at the lessons for the rest of the world as well. As far as I see it, I would have preferred to use the term fractured instead of fragmented. For fragmented gives me the impression that it's like Humpty Dumpty, where the pieces can never be put together again. But if it's fractured, I do believe that we have been through this before and that there can be a healing of fractures as well. The way I see the world today, it's inevitable that in a world in flux, we are in fact increasingly divided along roughly 7 factors, the 7 T's as I would put it. We have trade greatly dividing the world today, but trade is also fungible and therefore not very easy to securitize, as we have seen in the narrative going from decoupling to de-risking, etc. It's management of what is called otherwise an inevitable dependency one on the other. But then there is technology, which is today reeling under securitization, and it is crafted much more carefully in terms of denials and sanctions, etc. Then there is the T of territory, which divides us whether in Asia, in terms of disputes, or in Europe. The 4th T of terrorism, without which dealing with terrorism is very important for societies to prosper and to make progress. And then we have the 5th T of tenets, as in narratives, as to whose narrative is superior and whose ideology is superior. The 6th one is transparency, or the utter lack of it today. And the seventh one is trust, which is also lacking across the board. But when I look at the scenario, I feel that we are all trying to reinvent the wheel. Because when you look at UNGA Resolution 75-1 of 21st September 2020, that is the 75th anniversary of the UN, it has everything in it. Mother's milk and apple pie, nothing that can be refuted by anyone. Gender equality, economic development, multilateral UN reforms, leave no one behind, all of it is there. And if you go back a little further to 2015, you have the UN that has already agreed on 17 SDGs. So why is it that we are today trying to reinvent the wheel when there is global consensus on what is of greater priority and urgency? And we have to therefore look at addressing the key concerns before the global south, especially.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me turn to Velina. Velina, a view from your part of the woods. Is there consensus? How deep is that consensus? And have we taken a sabbatical from that consensus while we pursue our own individual priorities? What defines the world of today?
When it comes to Europe, I'm probably one of those who are not so optimistic when it comes to consensus. Of course, you mentioned something very important, and that is that Europe, contrary to other continents, has turned into an institutional actor and has been contributing as an institutional actor to the normative space. Specifically when it comes to tackling global challenges and issues, not only climate change, by the way, or development aid or hunger. But then again, we've also seen from the last, let's say, 15 months that Europe, the very same Europe, is showing, and I would really use the word fracture rather than fragmentation, is showing symptoms of fractures within the family of the 27 members. Even if you take the whole debate of the European solidarity when it comes to the support for Ukraine in Russia's war, even there we see that there is no strategic consensus on the final goal. What is the ultimate goal? Where does Europe want to be in this war? And what really, really troubles me personally is that in times of crises, all the normative framing is put aside because we turn into a modus of every country for itself. We've seen this during the pandemic when borders were shut down. We've seen this also during the war when commodities were weaponized, where actually countries in other parts of the world, for instance in Asia, fell victim to European interests because European clients took away, for instance, the gas or the LNG because they could afford themselves the higher prices. And once again, I clearly see right now this kind of polarization emerging when it comes to the future of the continent. Some member states put security issues first and the global issues second, and other member states of Europe, of course, still want to see themselves actually as a global actor. And in the end, I argue that in Europe, all member states have become very small. It's just that some don't realize it yet. I mean, the whole continent is shrinking under the weight of the global issues, but also under the weight of shifting global order, in which Europe probably not going to play this role anymore as it was in the past.
How important is the conversations that are taking place in the emerging world, developing world for Europe today? Is anyone listening to us? You are now here in Kigali, Rwanda. I hope you can talk to a number of your colleagues from this part of the world. You would find a very different texture of conversations. You might suddenly realize that there is a whole world out there which is not necessarily engaged in something that is consuming you today. Now let me flip it around. Is Europe aware of the world here, or is Europe too busy with itself right now?
The short answer is Europe is too busy with itself right now, and there are indeed players within the European decision-making. Once again, it's very, very complex decision-making meanwhile. I mean, even Europeans don't get it. because of the multi-layer processes, but the institutions are listening as well. So when it comes to the European institutions, the European Union institutions, they are listening as well. They are also trying to make a difference. And my point here is that in the end, in terms of crises, we've seen this before, and I am afraid that we are sliding into the same scenario as 100 years ago. When the crisis starts really, really becoming too painful, especially for the smaller European states, it will be national interests first, institutional approaches second. And this is unfortunately not very optimistic diagnosis I have for you.
Sarah, maybe you might give us a positive response. How is the BRICS going? India, China, Russia, Brazil, and South Africa. How is it going? You're chairing it.
It's going. It's going. I think that while we would have assumed that COVID was going to break BRICS apart, it didn't, and instead we rallied together. And I'm yet to find any formation that created a vaccine center in the middle of that crisis, right? Show me anyone anyone in the world that has done that. I think, secondly, now with the conflict, I think the assumption was that again we were going to falter and disappear as BRICS. Yes, there are challenges. However, I think it is moving in ways that are also unsettling for the power bloc, certain power blocs, and that's why we are, even in South Africa, faced with the conundrums that we are faced with today as we chair. But let me also, just chip in on the arguments around whether it's fracture or fragmentation. I think it's fracture or fragmentation for Europe. And that fracture or fragmentation assumes that as Africa, we've been part of it. Right. So this crisis of fracture and fragmentation actually means nothing to the African continent when we have never been part of the formation. I think today we are talking about multilateralism, and my biggest bet and my assumption is it's precisely because it has evaded us. And that is why we need to talk about how do we come back to the ideals, to the ideas, to the vision of that multilateralism that never existed in the first place, or it never existed for Africa. And this is why we are in Kigali today to talk about that multilateralism that has always not been in our favor. And hence we've been in the 90s, 80s, and even less so maybe today, we've been talking about certain global institutions that never favored the continent. But through BRICS, we are able to then bring together certain voices that speak to the global south and our reality. I think, though, the danger will be for us to start assuming, again, falling into the trap that Africa is a homogeneous continent. It's vibrant, it has its own agency that we need to at least acknowledge.
So, Sarah, just one more question on this. Your presidency is focusing on Africa. Indian presidency, like I said, is focusing on the global south. We have already met 125 countries. Our prime minister and other senior leadership met with their counterparts prior to the commencement of the G20 proceedings. Now, can we, through this process, attract attention from those who have the means to contribute to the needs of the global south? So one is that BRICS will do it by themselves, which you and I both agree would be an arrangement which would not be fully efficient. Other would be that we bring partners in. Now, how can your presidency or the Indian presidency, and thereafter the Brazilian and others who follow suit, how can they draw attention and then draw partnerships into the aspirations and ambitions that you are espousing this time around?
And I appreciate that from Rwanda and particularly this part of the world, what we are learning is the importance of dialogue. I think from South Africa, the importance of consensus and inclusivity, right, in the agendas that we pursue. I think, yes, talk is okay, but I think if we identify common agendas to take us forward of peace and security, of poverty and inequality, of gender inclusivity, for example. So it can't just be we are coming together because we believe that we need to be coming together. It has to be grounded on the vision of a new world that we want. I'm sad that there's a crisis now in Europe, but with that crisis means we, for the first time as the global south, with India and many other parts of Europe, can coalesce around this is an unjust world and therefore it needs to change. So I think for me it's about what is the agenda that will bring us together rather than just bringing in unnecessarily so.
So I think that's a good point which I'll come and explore with all of you again. Is this the moment when we can fix things? And I'll come to that question. That's an important issue you've raised. But before I come to that, let me turn to Yuvan. Yuvan, you've been watching global politics, the world order, European politics for a while now. Let me ask you this question. What is the European take on the seemingly less enthusiastic response from the global south? How are folks rationalizing it? How do they explain it to themselves? And what is being done to rectify it or respond to it?
Well, first of all, it's great to be in Kigali again, and especially talking about this issue, because I was born in Belgrade, that time capital of Yugoslavia, country that doesn't exist any longer, and that was one of the founders, together with India, Indonesia, and Egypt, of non-aligned movement. And today, when we are referring to Global South, we are actually referring to the same idea of making our world order more multilateral, more balanced, and more just. And that was precisely the idea of non-aligned movement. And of course, non-aligned movement played a pivotal role in liberation of many countries, not only in Africa, but elsewhere, which was of course very, very important. And I personally do agree why countries, especially in Africa, feel that they simply were not involved in creation of this world order that we have today, and in creation of these institutions, in a way that was the package deal that they were in a way forced to accept, because that was the deal for them to get their independence, you know, and they didn't have a lot of say. And the world has changed in the meantime. What we have today G20, and I do believe that G20 is today becoming the sole important platform between global North and South. And it is increasingly being viewed like that in Brussels, because of course, European Union is collective member of G20, together with several member states that are either full members or, in case of Spain, that are permanently being invited as guests. So I do believe that there is understanding that the G20 is today this platform for coordination and for discussion. Because, of course, I mean, even before war in Ukraine and even before UN Security Council became completely blocked because of disagreement on the nature of that war, UN system, of course, was not the most efficient one, as we all know. And it is good that now we have Indian chairmanship. I think it's Indian presidency of G20 is extremely active. The number of topics that you are covering is extremely impressive, both through Sherpa and through finance streams. I think it's really great job, and it is drawing a lot of attention, at least in the circles that I'm discussing it.
There is also a sizable discussion in Europe on how do they reach out to the South. You know, you heard Macron talk about it, you heard a few other leaders mention this. How do they create a new framework of engagement with the rest of the world? Now, are these speeches, or are we going to see a new outreach, a new texture to the engagement? Are we seeing this as tactical to get them on their side at this time? Or is this going to be transformational and build a new relationship completely? And maybe, you know, Valina, you could maybe share your thoughts on this aspect, because we've heard this coming out of Europe that we have to re-engage and rethink about our engagement. What does that really mean?
Well, as Velina mentioned before, basically, there isn't really a joint or common foreign policy interest or strategy of European Union. We are talking about, 27 member states that very often have their, different approach and different national interests, This is why you do not have foreign ministry of Europe. You have something that is called, well, I'm not even going to repeat how it's called, but it's something to do with some action service, So it is very, very clear that there isn't a ministry and that there isn't a real joint foreign policy. So this is the reason why, for example, you have President Macron that supported membership of African Union in G20, collective membership. I think this is very important. This would be very important next signal to have African Union as collective member in G20. And I think that the fact that we now have 3 consecutive presidencies from Global South is the great, time to do it. And, as you rightly mentioned, in African Union, even more, you have this kind of different interests and nuanced approaches to different topics. So this is why it is important to have, African Union as collective member of G20 and to have more African countries, I would say, as members of BRICS. I know this is also a topic now, and I hope that, during your
Sarah
summit
is
in
smiling.
August. Exactly. And I hope that she's going to respond to this. Thank you.
So Sarah is going to come back on that. Sarah, you want to quickly come in before I move to the next round of questions?
There's G20, there's BRICS, there's the African Union. I think none of those formations should nullify each other's existence. There's a reason why we have African Union, there's a reason why we have BRICS, there's a reason why we have G20, and all of those can coexist as equals and be on the table and as equal voices. And I think there's agency, there's power, there's voice, right?
Great. The next round, and I'm going to start with you again, Ambassador Chinoy. So clearly we have some sort of an odd situation. Some people describe it as the inertia of multipolarity, that when you have multiple power centers, multiple actors with different agendas, you tend to be frozen into inaction, or rather you find it difficult to create consensus. And yet, we have heard in the opening session that we confront common challenges. Climate being the most obvious, but the future of our technology and digital societies being another one. SDGs and poverty and the backsliding courtesy the pandemic for many of our fellow citizens around the world are all real issues. Now, having heard all of this having heard yourself in the first segment of this, I would like to discuss with all of you, starting with Ambassador Chinoy, how could we create frameworks that could respond to some of these most urgent challenges? So what could be a climate response in a world where we are disagreeing on literally everything else? And can we come together? Can China and US work together on climate, for example? Or can Europe and Africa have a trustworthy relationship? You mentioned trust. Can we somehow create specific trust for specific tasks in a world that doesn't trust each other generally?
So to start with, I would say that it's not really multipolarity that has caused inertia. In fact, if anything, multipolarity should add to the dynamism that is being seen around the world as we move towards greater multipolarity, less multilateralism. It's multipolarity that is actually trying to keep things going. But the 3 real issues that have caused this kind of fracturing, if I could continue to use that term, is firstly that globalization has not benefited all equally. In fact, some have gamed globalization, some have benefited more, some have benefited hardly from globalization. The second problem is that the balance of power is not the same as it was at the end of the Second World War when the current multilateral structures were set up. And there is an uncanny reluctance to accept the change in the balance of power. So that is causing a lot of tension and fracturing also. The third point here is what I would call the privileging of priorities. To see it in a blinkered manner from one's own geography, one's own nationalism, and I think that is challenging what we call the efficacy of multilateral institutions. And I think the G20 is well placed to speak on behalf of the large majority because it includes the permanent members of the Security Council, it includes the BRICS, it includes just about 50% of this membership of G20 plus the 9 invitees. Together, when we look at it, 14 turn up to be with a Global South identity. So the Global South is also inherently represented in the G20. And I think the G20 therefore needs to sort of speak on behalf of the global community without any kind of privileged exceptionalism. Now, if within the G20, which also has the G7, if the G7 under Japan's leadership works very well with India, we can actually achieve much more for the Global South. If the G7 is torn between that and its prioritization of certain issues and moves towards kind of reflecting the priorities that ought to be before the P5 in the Security Council, if it starts working like the Security Council, focusing more on sanctions, focusing more on some kind of exclusive sort of dealing of the challenges currently in Europe, then I think the Global South will get relegated to the background.
So both of you, Johan, and both of you, and yourself, you both highlighted the importance of G20 at this time. But we know that getting outcomes in G20 today is difficult because of what you called privileged prioritization. At the G20, we are seeing this play out. We are seeing the European situation overwhelming any other form of progress. So how do we get the G20 to agree on climate action if G20 is the best body to respond to climate challenge? I know you can't give that answer, but I'm saying let's think about it. I love that word. Privileged prioritization is something that is today playing out even at the G20, and the G20 is being made ineffective because in a geo-economics body that was supposed to solve problems that dealt with social economic issues is now becoming increasingly politicized and spending enough, most of its time discussing war and peace. So, let me turn to you, Valina. If G20 is the arena that has some semblance of acceptance and perhaps even representation that works, how do we make it work?
Let me start very shortly with the diagnostics, because I think that we are approaching towards my ideal concept, but we are not there yet. And in order to answer your question, I need to introduce the audience a little bit to my world. First, I think that we are on the verge of something where the old world is dying, obviously, and the new world is struggling to get born. And in this kind of context, it is a struggle of the traditional powers. So going back to the question of power, because the question of power, unfortunately, once again is going to affect all other questions. And right now, we don't have an answer to the question of power in terms of global power equilibrium. We clearly see that there are three contendants, three actors who want to solve this question for themselves: United States, China, and Russia. And everyone else is practically running the risk of falling victim to their battle. And as it was rightfully pointed out, I think that the rest of the world doesn't want to be part of this. The rest of the world doesn't want to get caught once again in a bifurcated world, in a world where only two options are on the table. The option of the pre-existent US-led system, because it's not only the global trade, it's the global economy. We see also the global financial system being still very much affected and controlled by US decisions. It's the US-led organizations, which are pretty much exclusive, as we know. And at the very same time, we see also a lot of successful efforts on behalf of China and Russia to reshape this global order to their interests, so for the sake of their interests. So in order to answer this question, how the G20 could actually tackle this, probably the straightforward answer would be to create platforms, initiatives, and constellations between state actors, institutions, which exclude these three. So in a sense, to create an alternative to a power equilibrium.
Keep US, Russia and China out of the room and get 3 others in. Is that the answer?
First, facing the reality.
No, I like that. You don't have to change your mind.
First, let's face the reality. And the reality is that we have already 2 rooms in which the Global South is not present. It's not only the West, it's not only the US room. The Dragon Bear room is pretty much also about Chinese and Russian interests and how the rest of the, of their partners. Well, let me give you an example, and we've seen this here in Africa. When Chinese or Russian delegation is traveling, it's not for the sake of African interests. It's not for the sake of a concrete geopolitical interest of a concrete state actor in Africa. It's first and foremost for the sake of their own geopolitical interests. When African countries were voting in the United Nations, for instance, in the General Assembly, it was because Russia was able and was successful in weaponizing commodities. Simple as that. So my point here is to realize what the reality is. And we all, I think, agree on what we don't want. And that is that we don't want another G2 world emerging out of this competition. We don't want another bifurcation. We don't want another Cold War 2.0. So in this case, non-alignment movement, in my view, and a strong role of India is not enough. It's no longer enough because the world has become too complex. It's no longer the analogy from the Cold War. Here on the table, India has a very different role to play. India is en route to becoming a world's economic power number 3, and is going to have a very, very big geoeconomic and geopolitical portfolio. So it's not only about being a leader of non-alignment movement. So my point here is how to create alternatives to the dynamics and the rationale of power politics and of realpolitik as we've seen it from the last 2 centuries. It hasn't worked. We should not allow another scramble for commodities and for natural resources, as it is already, by the way, happening, as we actually are trying to come up with ideas how to tackle climate change. What was the first thing that happened during the energy crisis in a war scenario in Europe? It was reaching out to African countries how to actually start exploring and exploiting fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. Whereas actually for the last 60 years, it wasn't on the table because there was a safe pipeline system for Russian gas and oil, right? So my point here is let's first wake up and see the world for what it is and not for what we wish it to be. Because in order to create a world that we wish, we need to fight a world that is
exists.
Right now.
Okay, Sarah. We don't want a G2 world. I think that's the takeaway from multipolarity is good. We don't want to be caught in a G2 trap. South Africa's own example, very strong partnerships with Russia, allegedly defense partnership with Russia, strong partnerships with China. I'm just reading newspaper reports. That major defense supplier, I'm just kidding. That's a newspaper report. Don't believe New York Times. Look, my point is that you do the Just Transitions partnership with Europe and America. Your climate action is in partnership with Western countries who are putting $10 billion on the table, who are helping you go green. Your political capital is invested with, as Velina says, the Dragon Bear. Russia and China expanding the BRICS, making it more relevant, making it the voice of a different world. Is this South Africa being very adept at multipolarity? Or are we still waiting to see how the die rolls?
First, if we work with the assumption that there's a state out there that does not have national interest and will not pursue its national interest, I think we are fooling ourselves, right? I think it is how we pursue our national interest at the detriment of others that it creates upheaval in the world. I think for me is how we bring in. So for example, this is exactly why BRICS was formed. So that it is not just the G20 meeting and just adding 9 or 8, sometimes 7 countries in the dialogue, or sometimes even begging to be included in the room for that discussion. That's why BRICS was formed. What we want in the world is I think for me, one, a much stronger African Union that does not necessarily need and beg to be invited to these spaces, but rather on its own power, rely on its own power, and realize its own power. We need to celebrate diversity instead of trying to bring all of us in one space, on just on the premise that there is the national interest only exists for Russia, for example, or India for that matter. South Africa, we also have our own national interest and our own challenges that we need to I think defend, and I think that's important. Instead of wanting us to have one world and we imagine that world is going to happen, it has not happened.
So the climate response happens through separate clubs of agreements. So you have countries who agree with you, and you try to find climate solutions in these smaller groups rather than seek this one universal approach that everyone's sign on to. Is that the future of climate response? Dispersed responses with small clubs working together, some in Africa, some in the West, some in East Asia. How do we respond to such a big challenge as climate change? Is the club approach better than a multilateral approach?
First, I think from where the vantage point of Kigali, I think we can't be solving problems that we didn't create, right? And therefore, the challenge needs to go back to Europe.
To origins.
Yes, and because now the sense that I'm getting is that the question is now we have to as Africa maybe.
No, fair enough. That's a fair
right?
position.
Yeah.
There's a fair position that we need those with the capabilities as well as those who had the largest part in creating it to do more, and that's a fair point. And I'll just come back to you on that. But I do believe there is some merit in thinking about not having to choose sides. And I guess many of us are trying to do precisely that. In fact, I would argue, since my colleague comes from Belgrade, I would argue that today, if you were to ask a European if they want to make a choice between China and America, and by the way, I did ask that question in Berlin a few weeks ago, I could see that there were not too many takers in a very black and white choice between China and the US. So, Johan, how does multipolarity play out from a European perspective?
Well, for example, when we are talking about the BRICS, the question that I'm hearing very often in Brussels these days is whether BRICS is going to remain a sort of the caucus of global South within G20, or is it going to grow to become really a global leader, at least in some of the issues of its interest? Now with the, establishment of special institutions like, a new development bank of BRICS, more talks about, maybe even a joint currency and all of that stuff. I mean, it looks that BRICS is now on the path to maybe transform itself into a really global leader, and not only that caucus of global South within G20. Second issue is, of course, the issue of Russia, whether Russia is going to try to use its membership in BRICS and to try in a way to weaponize BRICS as a sort of the anti-Western club. This is something that is, of course, of great interest, both for Brussels, but also for Washington. And then the third issue is the issue of principles and values. If anybody of us wants to have bigger decision-making power, with that bigger power comes bigger responsibility. And that responsibility is not to ignore, but to actively promote universal values. And one of universal values, and you mentioned that in United Nations system and then charter, they are more or less everything that we would now agree here upon, but unfortunately it is not being respected. And some of the major world powers actually are completely ignoring what they officially subscribe to, when they created UN system. But what is important is that, sovereignty, territorial integrity of UN member states is not something that is up to debate. This is not something about taking sides. If Russia attacks Ukraine, of course this is aggression. Of course this is, violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty of a sovereign country, member states of United Nations. This is not about taking sides. This is about respecting and promoting our joint values and principles.
So, I'm going to take questions from all of you. Are you all warm? Are you all warmed up? Can you ask questions? Are you interested in? Yeah, so you can walk to the mic here, and there is a mic coming to your right-hand side. You can walk up to the mic and pose your questions. We will try and collect 2 or 3 of them. So we have a gentleman here who wants to ask a question. Please walk up to the mic. Anyone here on this side wants to come to the mic?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Vishnu Upreti from Nepal. I am a researcher, policy researcher. I have 2 interrelated short questions. One, during the COVID time, we really saw the face of the powerfuls, those who were able to produce the vaccine, and they were restoring for their third dosage, and the people in the country where there was no vaccine were dying for the first dosage, and there was no such type of the collaboration. So how we can see that? The second point to all of you is that is still the non-alignment is a valid international instrument, or now it is a need to go through the alliance of the common interest or the national interest of the commonalities? Thank you.
Okay. Any other question for this round, or I come back? He's asked 2 questions, and both of them are interesting. Okay. So let's start non-alignment. Ambassador Chinoy, non-alignment or its variants, how important are they in today's world? And maybe let's take that first, and we'll come to the pandemic after this.
So I think the starting point here is that the world needs more than binary choices. And the African continent, as in the African Union, or a large country like India, we can, working together, actually offer something beyond those binary choices. And India has shown that willingness and that performance during periods of crisis, including during the pandemic. I think the last thing we want is spheres of influence, which is why the Indo-Pacific is also very important, because it is far more representative than the privileged concept of the Asia-Pacific, which some countries want to preserve as a sphere of influence. And we have to get away from that, because the Indo-Pacific includes Africa, it includes all of us, and is more in tune with our aspirations, more democratic, more representative. But I do feel that it is time for us to look at core values when we are looking at multipolarity. And non-alignment is not a bad word. It has also not remained dormant or stagnant. It has evolved. Even at the height of non-alignment, you are aware that many countries that were in the NAM movement were actually quite aligned. Many hosted bases for one superpower or the other. Many sought help and assistance from the one or the other of the superpowers at times of need. Today, I would say it's not so much non-alignment as multi-alignment or issue-based alignment. And that, I think, is a right that we all reserve for ourselves. Our South African colleague also said that there's no country in the world that does not act in its national interests. So non-alignment is different today. In a multipolar world, it is multi-alignment and issue-based alignment. And may there be more of that, because that really creates a level playing field, which allows the lesser powers among us, lesser economies, to actually bridge the absolute gaps in comprehensive national power through such hedging, multi-alignment, and issue-based alignment. May there be more of it.
Sarah, you want to comment on this?
I agree completely with this, by the way.
You endorse it. Sarah, you want to comment?
I agree. I think that we have such a complex world now with complex challenges that we've never even anticipated as a human species, that we can't go back to old tactics that got us even to these problems that we are faced with today. And that is why I'm in total agreement that it has to be issue-based, given where we are with our climate, that we are about to go extinct as human beings, right? The levels of inequality in the globe, I think, are just astonishing. If you think about it, I think in my own country, if you think about the gap between those who have the means and those who don't, I think that we have reached such a crisis point that we can't employ old tactics. Thanks.
Vilina, anything to add, or you've already spoken on this subject, but go ahead.
Well, quite fascinating topic. It's really one of the topics that that concerns me most. And because Sarah mentioned something about complexity, and I was just thinking about this quote, which is saying that the opposite of simplicity is fragmentation and alienation. And we cannot allow, actually, this kind of simplicity to re-enter our spaces and to re-enter our exchange. And that is why I'm really calling for the recognition of the risk in which, you know, most, I think, states are currently pretty much concerned with themselves and are not really able to anticipate. And that is to avoid these binary choices, to avoid a new Cold War scenario in which, one again, there will be winners and there will be, you know, losers. There will be contested spaces, geographic spaces. There will be a scramble for resources. And by the way, from my geopolitical perspective, where I see the energy transition really with the critical glasses is this scramble for the new resources, a lot of them in Africa, where once again, for the sake of something good, where some states want to keep their environment clean, other states should destroy their environment. I cannot agree with this concept. And this is what I'm trying also to explain in Europe, that you cannot have the whole cake and eat it. You cannot have your climate clean at the cost of someone else's destroyed environment. And I think that being in a digital revolution, we can make things transparent so that people who have access, I mean, India is the perfect case, the perfect example, the country with the largest, you know, digital transactions in the world. So people are checking these things right now. We have the information. We need to provide the information. We need to be responsible experts, analysts, stakeholders, decision makers. This is the difference this time.
So let's conclude this conversation with the, unless someone else has a question, let me conclude with the second, Andre, please come to the mic. So while he walks to the mic, let's move to the second point raised by our colleague from Nepal. He has mentioned the rather selfish behavior during the pandemic of the big nations, the rich nations, the lack of generosity, the small heart, the pettiness sometimes, even when it came not just to the vaccine, but also to simple things as gloves and masks and medical equipment. Does that give you hope of a possibility of a global collective responding to these big challenges? Or when it comes to crises, we are bound to go back to being the least common denominator, the very animalistic tendencies will resurface and define governance rather than concern for shared protection. So that's a question he asked. You saw the pandemic, now you want to talk about values. How does that square up? You talked about protecting yourself, and now you want others to help you in your times of crisis or side with you. How does that square up? I think that's the larger question. So, Yovan, let me start with you this time. A friend from Nepal posed this question to you.
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that I think that our global response to the COVID crisis was the best so far. And I think that we have to realize that. Of course, there were a lot of, differences in approaches. There were a lot of vices that we showed as humanity, along the way, and our distinguished friends mentioned some of those. But generally, as a human race, our response to that was much, much better than ever before. And I'm convinced that next time it's going to be even better. Of course, I'm not really desiring next pandemic, to show up anytime soon. But I mean, we are going to have this kind of global crisis one way or another. And I think that now we are better prepared than we were before this. I think this is something that that we should realize. The same goes with G20 that we were discussing. It is far away from being superb or efficient, but this is, at the moment, the most efficient platform between global North and South that we have. So my question to all of us here is that what do we do? India now has as one of its priorities of G20 presidency, discussion about what kind of multilateral institutions we need for 21st century, if I'm right.
Yes, reform multilateralism is
exactly.
a priority.
So the question is whether we try to completely scrap the current system that we have, the current international order, and build something completely new, or we try to make the current system simply more efficient and more functional and more just.
Okay, Sarah, over to you. Our response has been better than he expected and has been very good.
I think that for me, the COVID years showed our limitations in simply bemoaning what Europe has always done, right? And I think for me, in working within BRICS, in the BRICS space, we showed that we can critique, but we can also find solutions. As I said, the BRICS Vaccine Center, for example. I'm also heartened by the work that India is doing in the T20 space, but we should also realize that change and transformation takes a bit of time to get there, but we need to start. And I don't, sometimes I hear you talk about the work that you are doing in India, particularly this year, and wanting change now. And I think that you are, these are building blocks. These are building blocks, and I'm hoping that South Africa will then take some of what. And I almost said revolutionary ideas. I think I will be in the wrong platform to talk about revolutionary ideas, right? Forward in ways that take humanity forward, not just our own countries.
Ambassador, you wanted to come in. Go ahead, it's working.
Yeah, I'm tempted to jump in here because I think it's not easy to scrap the current international order. In fact, it's very difficult to bring about genuine reform, as we've all seen. Even if we look at the UNGA route to reforms of the United Nations, we must realize that you require 2/3 majority and you require all the 5 permanent members voting in favor of any change to implement any change. So that change is not going to come about voluntarily or from a goodness of the heart, etc. It's very difficult once there are privileged positions. What we have to see is how we can not just reinvigorate the existing system, but to try and bring about meaningful reforms. But even more important is to see how existing institutions can cooperate with new and parallel institutions. And if we can have some kind of a modicum of equality, democracy, and give and take, we might be able to perform better, I think, including for climate finance and things like that. So parallel institutions, the AIIB or the New Development Bank or the BRICS, these must also be seen for the value that they might bring to certain geographies especially.
Andre, sorry I kept you standing for a while. So the final question for this evening, you want to come to the mic here? We'll take both of them and we will have 1 minute. Oh, please, you come in too. Come, join us. Please, Ambassador. So you can just stand behind Andre there, and Ambassador, you can come behind on this mic here. There's a mic here as well. Yeah, so we have 4 questions, short questions and rapid fire answers. We are in the rapid fire round now. We have to save multilateralism by being rapid. Okay. Andre.
Many thanks, Samir, and many thanks to the panel for a vibrant and very relevant discussion. I have 2 points. Actually, I have many, but I'll try to restrict my question. Yeah, rapid. All the pressing issues that we have to deal with today globally, including climate change and health and pandemic, they seem to be all subsumed by concerns with security and power, right? And that's not surprising. International relations theory would lead us to expect as much. But shifts in distribution of power also threaten the institutions that we have, and they lead to this fragmentation or fracture, as the ambassador would put it. So my first question is, do you agree with that, and what can we do in the face of these security challenges, which again tend to undermine all other issue areas? And then regarding the institutions, there seems to be, there's no salvation outside of them. As much as I can appreciate the merits of non-alignment, as much as I know that the Global South is generally excluded from these institutions, and I know Africa has been by and large, but Latin America doesn't fare much better either. We need them because it's better to operate in a rule-based system than to face the North or the most powerful actors on your own. And because we cannot promote trust, which has been an issue of the panel, and values outside of them either. We need some sort of coordination. And so, again, I ask if you agree.
I think that was a statement, not a question. Institutions, that was his description of an institution, great. But we'll try and get the responses to that ideal.
I'll stop here.
Let
Thank
me come to you.
Thank you very much, Samir. Mohammed Al-Jarrah from Libya. And my question is specifically to Sarah. In 2011, the South African president then led the most sensible initiative in 2011 to try and to find a good conclusion to, let's say, the civil war that erupted in Libya, or the upspring that erupted in Libya. But unfortunately, it was vetoed by Western countries in particular, but also some regional ones that were intervening to overthrow the Gaddafi regime. And the African Union, South Africa, were not able to do anything. Another example is that the African Union has been asking to have a special envoy from the UN to Libya. It took a decade for that to happen. And then when it happened, right now we have SRSG Abdullah Bathily. He's being undermined quite significantly. And the idea is as follows, is that...
Rapid.
Yeah, very quickly. The idea is as follows, is that if you're either an American or a European, it will work. If you're an African, it's not going to work. My question to you is, earlier you said that the BRICS exists, the African Union exists, and it's good that they all exist in their own right. But my question to you is, South Africa is a member of the BRICS. Are there ways where the BRICS complements the role of the African Union, supports the role of the African Union? Are there instances that happens, or how it should happen in that
Thank
sense?
you. Please.
Hello, good evening. My name is Francine Martin. I'm a researcher and project manager from Brazil. And you mentioned regarding the efficiency of India presidency of G20. And I would like to know, my question is very simple. I would like to know what are the perspectives for the Brazilian presidency for the G20 for the next presidency.
Ambassador.
Thank you. Well, I'm from Egypt. Multilateralism has been bashed a lot tonight. So just to mention, Egypt, we hosted COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh with historic agreement on loss and damage, historic reference in a climate COP on transformation of the financial system. I was involved in the first time initiative on climate and peace. So there are possibilities to move things forward in the multilateral. So my question is, how do we put the thinking into creating the conditions of replicating such agreements to address global issues? And artificial intelligence, for example, it calls to us all. So how do we mobilize to create the conditions to make multilateralism work? Thank you.
Okay, so let's go down the panel now. We have a question on South Africa and BRICS supporting AU and the Libya issue as the point of departure. We have a question on multilateral institutions work and how do we make them work better, and COP27 was an example. We have an issue, we had a philosophical discussion with Andre on institutions as well as the two different, the centripetal and centrifugal forces, issues and power dynamics, both in some sense pulling us in different directions. How do you reconcile that? And finally, the complete overwhelming security discourse that prevents sensible discussions on human conditions, including SDGs and others. And of course, final question to you was, Ambassador Chinoy, on what do you want from the Brazilian presidency? You are going to be hosting 120 track 1 events, another 100 or so track 2 events. Do you want them to also have a party every day in Rio for the next year? So what are your expectations from the Brazilian presidency?
My own view is that India's G20 presidency should not be seen as a one-off event. In fact, the very fact that we have a series of developing countries of the Global South chairing the G20 augurs well. It should be a relay in which we each contribute to the next presidency. So I think Brazil will have an advantage that it can build on what India does this year, and India has also greatly benefited from Indonesia. South Africa will also benefit in the future. As far as the securitization question is concerned, I do feel that some countries have used the phenomenal accretion of economic power to securitize certain geographies. And I think that is creating an issue. It's a practical reality of life, but I wish there were less of it. And if countries were able to separate their privileged, securitized positions in the UN Security Council from the pressing economic requirements of the Global South, they would do humanity a great deal of good.
You want?
Well,
you can pick up any question that was asked in this point.
Sure. Let me just continue with this question on security. I am not very optimistic that any sort of advancement on the current behavior within UN Security Council is likely or possible. And I'm of course not optimistic that we are going to see a reform of UN Security Council or UN system anytime soon. Unfortunately, I would add. But this is why I was mentioning G20 as the best one we have, with all, of course, the flaws that are there. Thank you.
Belina.
I will take on from here and just wrap it up as one response. Security concerns, unfortunately, are predominating, and obviously, it is the end of the globalization as we know it. But that doesn't mean that there won't be any regional integration. On the opposite, so this is good news for the Global South. Second important issue, the recalibration of the global system is taking place in the Indo-Pacific. That means that we are going to see a lot of competition and a lot of block building and a lot of sphere of influencing in the Indo-Pacific. So the open question mark about Ukraine right now is going to be transferred to the Indo-Pacific when it comes to the open question mark about Taiwan in the future. And that, of course, has to tell us one thing. If there are two players that can actually decide over strategic spheres of influence, what would prevent them from penetrating other regions and other parts of the world? And why should then the West actually still accept that? So this is actually the big question mark for this decade, whether we are not sliding into a spiral of escalation. I am absolutely against any kind of overthrowing of international institutions, because institutions have this tendency of once being into an existence, to stay for a long time. So the only option is to actually to adapt them bottom up. And here the good story is that there are more stakeholders, more players. G7, as we know it, is going to be the past in probably 10 years from now. So there will be new blocks, there will be new formations, there will be more players. And specifically, when it comes to Africa, Latin America, and the Asian continent, competition has also good news. And that is that if you are smartly diversifying, that means more players from more states, more institutions, more companies, more corporations, but also more private-public partnerships. Actually, the states can navigate the processes in this critical decade, and this is what I expect also for the international institutions. So as we are actually sliding into these critical processes. We should be mindful of the risks, but we should be also optimistic about the opportunities that can emerge out of them.
Sarah.
Libya is, for me, is a classic example of what global governance is in this world. The same energy that we are putting today on the Ukraine-Russia conflict, we did not put the same energy when it came to Libya. So I think for me, and that remains my own thinking, that it was disappointing. But I think that what we know now of Ukraine and Russia, had we known that we would employ such energy and dynamism in terms of global governance there, I think the world would have been a better place, because we would have learned from India. From South Africa's side, indeed, it was disappointing that we could not at least proceed in terms of having a peaceful Libya. South Africa, as I see it, it's not whether it's BRICS or AU. I think there was a question. It's both, much as we will also celebrate IPSA, for example. And this is why, for us, it's about diversity and issue based. So any thinking that we will prioritize AU, for example, over BRICS, I think it is not truly understanding South Africa and what South Africa is wanting to achieve. And I think from South Africa's point of view, it is a just global world, not just South Africa, not just the continent, but the world.
Great. I think this is a good note to conclude this particular conversation, so that we can have more over the next 2 days. Plenty to think about. I particularly picked 3 ideas. One of them was that G20 may be our best chance. Let's try and invest in it. We have a chance from the global south to shape some of the agenda, to reprioritize our own aspirations and our own concerns. And can we do that over the next few years, where the southern countries would be leading this grouping? And as Ambassador Chinoy mentioned, we must not pretend to speak for the South. We must certainly be empathetic and consult the South before setting that particular agenda that tries to respond to 6 billion humans who have not necessarily been represented on the high table. The second good idea, of course, is on issue-based partnerships. Whether it's just transitions, whether it is COP27, where loss and damage could be tackled, one of the contentious issues for a long time, and I think congratulations to Egyptian leadership for doing that. So issue-based partnerships, issue-based consensus is still possible, and we have achieved a lot based on that, including, by the way, if someone was to agree with your framing of pandemic response, we would argue that it was again partnerships around the challenge of producing vaccines and responding that kind of work. So I think issue-based partnerships are going to be far more important than ideological partnerships. Those died in the 20th century. In the 21st century, you have to find areas of convergence and common collaboration. And the third idea that I really found interesting here was on the notion of the intersection of multiple groupings. Now, multipolarity, I would tend to agree with Ambassador Chinoy as we conclude, may actually be one of the get-arounds, the current impasse in the international system. It is 3 smaller groupings that are powering humanity forward. But these smaller groupings also need to talk. And it is the intersection of these multiple groupings, BRICS could be one of them, the SCO could be another one, the G20 and the G7, some more. It is these overlapping plurilateral groups and the members who are common in these various groups that will lend to a degree of coherence and stability and form as we navigate a new era where multilateralism of the 20th century has died and 21st century is still seeking one. So in the interim, I think it is these small clubs, bigger unions and powerful groupings that will have to, in many ways, create a kaleidoscope of institutional arrangements that will manage the world. Plenty to do over the next 2 days. Please join me in applauding my wonderful panelists for their insights.